I just have to stand up, and that happens. Wow. I wish that I had that authority with my 5-year-old child. Not that I'm comparing you to 5-year-old children. Sorry. Right, I'll start again. Welcome to this, I was going to say panel, but it's not really a panel either. It's more like a round, obviously. And I've never done this format before in the OECD, and I think this is a new format for them too. So I don't know whether that means I have to walk around a bit more, or because I'm sure these people over here are not going to want to see the back of my head. But anyway, we'll try and swivel as much as possible. My name is Shiv Malik. I'm a former journalist, author, broadcaster, etc. And protest is one of my favorite subjects. So this panel is called From Protest to Solutions. And we'll be asking, amongst many other things, what is protest? What is the point of it? How has it changed in the last 20 years? Because it's changed a lot. What can we learn from it? And how do we create tangible change after people take to the streets? You've probably heard that this is the 20th year of the forum, and that it was formed in response to the mass protests that exploded onto the streets of Seattle during the WTO convention in 1999. And it's at this point that I want to put forward a sort of controversial view here, that those protests successful in shutting Seattle down led to fear from government representatives inside that convention, fear of the people that they were meant to represent. And that fear turned within a year and a half to actually terrible repression. So let's go back, not to 1999, but 2001, to the G8 meeting in Genoa, Italy, to remind ourselves how repressive government's responses, in fact, were. This is from a Guardian report, recording the words of a guy called Mark Koval. He was a web designer for the Genoa protesters' indie media news site. You remember indie media, don't you? Yes. He and his fellow protesters were lodged for the night in a school when the police arrived at midnight to clear them out. A carabinieri whacked me in the neck and with his shield pushed me up against the wall. I fell to the ground and 4 or 5 carabinieri started kicking me really hard in the chest, legs, back. I heard my ribs break like snapping matchsticks. I was still conscious at this stage. They take a running jump at you like kicking a football. Somebody dragged him by the neck to the front of the school and he was beaten again. That was by far the worst. I thought, my God, this is it. I'm going to die. In fact, someone did die during those protests, a protester called Carlo Giuliani. In fact, scores of people were also beaten to pulp that night, and subsequently many were tortured in incarceration, a fact confirmed by the European Court of Human Rights 14 years later when it found Italy guilty of using torture against those protesters. It's a pretty shameful moment for Europe. But what changed everything was not directly related to the brutality of the state or the protesters, but actually the events of September the 11th. A new dialogue forced itself into the body politic of the West. We'll perhaps talk about that shortly. And yet the resentment against globalization still continues, and now it festers on the right of the political spectrum, revisited in the form of Trump and Steve Bannon, Brexit, the European far right, and the recurrent Gilets jaunes protests, perhaps to name just a few. There have been other resentments too since 1999 which have created huge protests. The Iraq war marches, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, Me Too, March for Our Lives, the Women's March on Washington, which in fact was the single largest protest in US history, and the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, and most recently, of course, the Gilets jaunes, as I mentioned, in the European youth-led climate marches, and so many more. Even in this digital age, it turns out, people still take to public spaces to express their desire for change. And if the popularity of a protest is a way to judge public sentiment, is it wise for governments to ignore big protest movements? Or to ask that question another way, should democratic governments be held to ransom by, well, let's put it this way, well-organized mobs? To answer these questions and more, we have with us a wonderful panel. Kathy Feingold is Director of the International Department of the AFL-CIO in the United States. It's the biggest labor organization. Anuna De Wever, de Heyden, the co-founder of Youth for Climate, Micah M. White, he's the co-creator of Occupy Wall Street and the author of The End of Protest, a new playbook for revolution. Wait, hang on. Here we go. Obligatory book promotion for Micah over there. But before I turn to the panelists, I thought I'd say a quick thing about the format. I like to be interactive, and this is a 90-minute session. So I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes just chatting with the panel. Then we're going to go to a first round of audience questions. It'll be brief, 5-10 minutes, but basically I'm here to just kind of get you warmed up. Then we'll come back to the panel for a 20-minute discussion, 25 minutes, and then we'll be back out to the audience for some more questions. So constantly back and forth. You know, it isn't just about us sitting here. It's very much about you. This is why we have this very circular format. It's quite exposing as well, right? There's nowhere to hide if you're sitting in the middle. First, I want to ask you guys a question before we start chatting between us. Oh, by the way, also, if you're going to ask questions, you can use the app, which is called Bcast. I'm not going to give the instructions on how to use that because I don't have them up here at the moment. But usually the instructions are either up there or under your seat somewhere. Are they on the seat? No, not on the seat. They're just up there. They're on the screen. There you go. Also, if you're going to tweet, please use the hashtag OECD Forum. That's for English language, or Forum OECD. OCDE, sorry, for the French language, which I've just massacred there. Now, okay, so question for the audience. Who here, put your hands up, who here has been in a protest themselves at any point in their life? Okay, so we've got veterans. Good. And then hands back up if you think that going on that protest or any other protest that you've been on has made a difference, either to you personally or to society around you. Okay. I don't think we need to do this panel, I feel. Like they're all convinced. We're preaching to a choir here if we're trying to convince people about the efficacy of protest. So, okay, to the panel. Just quickly. What was the first protest you were involved in? Anuna.
I've been in a lot of protests since my parents are two activists, but I think the first one I really remember was when Donald Trump came to Belgium and we went on the streets with thousands of people to make it clear that he knew that he was really not welcome.
Okay. Micah?
I have been an activist my entire life. That's all I've ever done. So I started organizing protests and campaigns when I was 13. So the very first thing I did is I refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, which is a kind of mandatory pledge before class begins in public schools in America.
Why did you refuse to do that?
You know, when you're 13, honestly, the reasons are never quite as rational as you know, at my age, looking back, I can give you eloquent reasons, but, you know, disobedience, dissatisfaction with how I didn't feel like I fit in. And then the words of the Pledge of Allegiance give a very glorified story of, you know, liberty and equality for all and all this kind of stuff. So, but rebellious spirit.
It's innate. Good. Kathy?
I was a student activist protesting U.S. involvement in the wars in Central America. The interventions.
What year?
The 80s.
In the 80s, okay. Kathy, just sticking with you, let's go back to Seattle in 1999. And yes, as I mentioned, obviously, this forum was formed in part in response to that moment. Can you explain for people here what that history was and what your involvement was in Seattle itself?
Well, the AFL-CIO was involved in helping to organize the mass demonstrations in Seattle. It was a really important turning point, and it's what got me involved as a young person looking to a labor movement, asking, is this the place I want to go, from sort of outside institutions to an inside to be able to continue to protest. And so it was the first time that the labor movements came together from around the world and joined hands with other social movements, including there was, you know, in the US we called it the Teamsters, which is one of the US unions, and the Turtles, which became, people dressed up as turtles to bring attention to environmental issues. And this was the first time that there was this deep questioning amongst lots of social movements that the form of globalization that was happening did not benefit the majority. It was a corporate-driven form of globalization, and it wasn't working for people, and it wasn't working for the environment.
And what do you think it sort of achieved?
I think
Because it wasn't just Seattle; it was the battle for Seattle. So, what do you think the protesters actually achieved? Not what they wanted to achieve, but what do you think it actually achieved?
Oh, I think it was an incredibly important protest. You know, I think up until that point, people sort of saw globalization like the weather, like it was something we couldn't control. You know, it was just sort of happening to us. Everything was global, you know, from food to the way we were doing trading and supply chains, and the fact that we were shifting major production from our auto industry in Detroit all around the world. Like, this was just like the weather. So I think what Seattle did was, this wasn't the weather. This was an intentional set of policies that were being driven by a set of institutions. So in this protest was targeting the World Trade Organization, but it was the World Trade Organization, the policies of the World Bank, structural adjustment policies that had been happening around the world in the 80s, and the International Monetary Fund, its lending practices and the conditions it put on, that those policy recommendations were shaping the form of globalization. Globalization in and of itself wasn't bad, but the way that these policies were driving it, which were corporate driven, was the problem. So I think that that forever changed the debate, that it wasn't just something happening to the world, it was a very intentional set, and we had the power to shape a different reality and a different set of policies that could work for people and the environment.
And what was the response inside the forum? I don't know if there's someone here who was inside that WTO meeting. No takers for that. Okay, just no one well connected enough, clearly. Who do you know? What could you just explain to the audience that actually there was this response from within the conference, and they sort of shut the conference down?
Yeah, they shut it down. I think
people couldn't physically get in.
Exactly, and this became sort of a format for ongoing protests, right? And so this Seattle became, all over. Then I think their response was they started going to countries that you saw even more restrictive policies. So going the Doha round, right? Going to countries that definitely weren't open to civil society, definitely had policies restricting protest movements. And so you could see they're intentional trying to hide and put bigger fences around these meetings, and literal fences, right? We heard about the protests around the G7 and G8. And so a phenomenal amount of money and energy was being invested, again, not in people, not in addressing climate issues, but creating walls so people couldn't come in and discuss this. So going back
Gleneagles was another sort of moment, right? This middle of Scotland in the middle of nowhere, turned into a fortress.
Absolutely.
Genoa had famously sort of missiles to stop from, sort of defend from whomever, and et cetera, et cetera. So these big,
Canada,
huge police,
every country
policing
became
moments,
a fortress. And so I think Seattle is a turning point, saying that these policies must be shaped by the people who are going to be impacted by them, and people have stakes. And the more they tried to create a fortress, and that it was just going to be the few elite that were going to make these decisions, the more protests and the more resistance and the lack of credibility they had.
Micah, you were a little younger. What did Seattle mean for you? Where were you in 1999? Not the whole year, obviously, just that moment. And what did it mean for you?
I mean, I was 17 in 1999, and I had been an activist for a while, but I was reading a magazine. My story is I was reading a magazine called Adbusters, and Adbusters has been talking about a social protest that was going to happen in Seattle in 1999. And when it did actually happen and it emerged as like this amazing thing, I became a devotee of Adbusters, and that's ultimately where Occupy Wall Street came from. It was a call put out by Adbusters magazine. So from the Seattle protests, it brought me into Adbusters magazine. I started to work there, and then so many years later, we created Occupy Wall Street. So I was a high school student, and it showed me the power and the capacity of disciplined militants to disrupt global structures through like kind of coordinated action. And their kind of non-hierarchical format is what really influenced Occupy, I think, in their consensus-based assemblies.
It's very interesting. It's a powerful point that the author Rebecca Solnit makes in her book, Hope in the Dark, which actually published not long after Seattle 1999. I have it here, and I will quote from it at some point later on, so apologies. But she makes the point that actually, even protests that in a sense fail, it goes on necessarily to inspire in the most sort of circuitous ways, So in effect, what she's sort of saying is that, nothing that succeeds in, anything that succeeds in coalescing people ultimately succeeds. So we have Seattle inspiring then effectively the co-creator of Occupy. You were born in 2001, so a couple of years after Seattle, but you must have seen Occupy. Did that inspire you?
Yeah, obviously. So I think that's the point, that all these demonstrations inspire each other. And the fact that, you see that you live in a world where I find is a lot of social injustice and we don't prioritize the important things. And so then you see that there are people coming on the streets, that it is effective, that there are rebels. And now you can see that there's like a revolution of a new generation who are rebelling against the system and rebelling against the fact that nobody's taking care of our future. But that is obviously inspired by other people who have stood up against injustice things in the past.
What is it like? I don't know whether this applies to any of you, either of you two as well, but what is it like to come from an activist family? My parents are basically completely apolitical, so I don't know what that's like.
For me, it's just like, I think my parents taught me from the beginning that I have to do something if I want to change something. Because I really see that there are lots of people who can really complain about things and really say like, and that's wrong, and we need to change that, and we need to do that. Instead of saying it, just do it, That's really what I've been taught to do, and that's what I think I'm doing right now. And I think it is very important, because activists really do make a change.
So there is this thing about activism, which is that you feel this sort of personal responsibility often leads to sort of burnout later on in many ways. So Anuna, just perhaps starting with you, what impact has it had in your life to sort of take responsibility for making this sort of change happen, right? Do you feel that burden personally, or you're like, it's okay?
Yeah, no, I do feel that burden, but you know what the problem is actually? It is not my responsibility, and I'm fighting for something, but it is not at all my responsibility to come on the streets every week, to work my ass off, to still like get my grades in school, but organize all these things, go to these events, spread the message. I shouldn't be doing that, because the core job of being a world leader and a politician is taking care of the planet and giving it to the next generation. But now that I have this kind of responsibility, it's me, huh?
Is it me? Is it my beard? I don't know. Sometimes that happens. No, I think we're fine. Keep going.
Yeah. Okay, we're good. So the thing is, I think now that I have this responsibility in Belgium mostly, it's really big, because I see, for example, on the strikes we've had 19 already. We do it every week, and journalists always come to me and ask me like, okay, why are there so many people? Why are there more? Why are there less? What do the politicians do? Blah blah blah. And I need to like have an explanation for everything, but I really feel like politicians do not have to explain why they are failing on literally every subject when it concerns to the climate crisis. And journalists keep asking us like, why are you coming on the street? When are you going to stop? With how many are you going to continue? But it is not, you don't have to look at us. You don't have to look at the thousands of people on the street. You really have to look at the politicians now. It's their time to talk and to do something and to act. But I feel like there are not enough people asking them to do it.
Well, I can only apologize for all journalists then. Micah, same question to you. What did it mean, in a sense, to feel this sort of, as a co-founder of Occupy, that sort of personal responsibility? Like, and did you suffer from burnout in the end?
Well, I mean, absolutely, burnout is one of the great challenges of activism. I've been an activist since, like I said, since I was 13, and as I get older and older, I see fewer and fewer activists. I think that, though, it's important to not overestimate the role of individual activists in creating these social movements. I think that a lot of times activists, we take credit for things that might be structural forces outside of our control. For example, like the birth of Occupy Wall Street and Arab Spring might have more to do with food prices than with the specific actions of activists calling for social change and all this kind of stuff. So I think that it is important to kind of, the way that I avoid burnout is two things. One, the study of social movements and revolutions show that they tend to emerge when they seem least likely. So whenever I feel despondent and like I'm burned out, that's actually when I think that it's about to break out, like the movement's about to break out. This is true. Trotsky talks about this with the Russian Revolution. If you talked to people before Occupy Wall Street, they said, no, nothing's going to happen in our country. Even when the Arab Spring was breaking out, people said no, Occupy is never going to happen in our country. So similarly, I think that when you feel low is when possibilities emerge, and when we feel overconfident, when we start celebrating the effectiveness of social protests and all this kind of stuff, is when I start to get a little skeptical and start to feel like I need to pull back.
Yeah, Solnit talks about, when the title of the book is obviously Hope in the Dark, but she talks about the darkness of both the grave and the womb, being two different types of darkness, obviously. Why are we so enamored with protest? And by that I mean, there's lots of different types of protest. Let's not get into the different speciations of all of those things. But just getting onto the street, why do we find that fascinating to look at or to be part of? Kathy?
Well, am I off now?
Yes.
Yeah, there we go. It's what brought me into the labor movement. It's a sense of collective power. We just heard, when the individual, and often there's a spark, there's individual leaders or people that stand up, or we see, Arab Spring, someone setting themselves on fire to make a strong point out of desperation. But the act of protest, especially collective protest, which as somebody that works in Washington, D.C. is now daily, there's just protests every day in DC. I think it's because it's a way of channeling our energy, but we got to remember it's a tactic, right? So protest in and of itself doesn't always lead us somewhere. And I think the challenge we've had in this, I'm talking as someone in the US, where every tweet, seems to get people out in the street and a protest for very good reasons. But I think what our challenge now is taking collective action and translating it into actual power. In the labor movement, it could be collective bargaining, so that you have power vis-a-vis an employer, so that workers are able to shape the imbalance of power between workers and corporations. So I think protest brings us all together. It's a way of channeling frustration, anger, and actually showing our leaders that they need to be responsive to us, right? Because sadly, I don't think many of them see their jobs as being responsive, so we remind them. We sit in front of them and say, you need to respond to the majority. So I think it's a powerful tool.
It is a sort of powerful tool. When politicians, though, famously tend to respond, perhaps, better to things like letter writing campaigns or just phoning their office, but those things don't get glorified. Is there an over-enamoration? That's definitely not a word, but I'm going to deploy that. Are we too in love with this idea? Does it go back to maybe, the French Revolution, that people walk into a street, demand change, it happens, and the world is better? Obviously what a juvenile story, it never happens like that, but why? Why that? Why not the letter writing, which is probably more effective?
I don't know if letter writing is necessarily more effective these days. And I think you've got, most people probably in this room get 1 million emails to click here and send a letter. And, now we have all the e-letter activism. I think you need to, first of all, start with your strategy. And so we're in a moment where, because our politicians, especially in the US, but in many countries, are doing so much that we need to be protesting and holding them accountable for, we're in a little bit of reaction mode. We need to pull back and be able to develop strategies so that we can figure out, here's where protest is going to have the most impact: a letter writing, a meeting, a Hill Day strategy in the context of the US, trying to influence policymakers, or strike, withholding your labor. For example, we just had a massive strike in a grocery store chain. Our teachers are going on strike. So that's another form of protest that is strategically used to say, we've had enough, and we're going to withhold our labor and force you to the table to talk to us to make real change. So it's different tactics.
Anuna.
Yeah, so indeed, I think that the civil disobedience about the whole striking thing is the most important thing, because we have had strikes on Sundays and we wrote thousands of letters and we really asked very nicely to do your job, but then if it doesn't happen, you have to do something against the rules to make people pay attention to you. You have to start breaking the rules, or at least push the boundaries, because otherwise it doesn't happen. So that's what I think why striking is so most effectively, because it is against the rules and it changes something about the system, and then politicians think oh my God, you're so annoying, now I have to pay attention to you,
So in a sense, it's about grabbing attention. Perhaps Occupy wasn't obviously a march, it was an occupation. Why that tactic? Was that tactic particularly effective, and do you think actually it's those kinds of tactics which can be even more effective? Because it shows real dedication. Is that the thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets back to like basically questions of theories of change behind activism. So I mean, if you look at the long history of social protest, like we have, it's amazingly, we actually have records from ancient Egypt, so 5,000 years ago, that show that, you know, there's papyri that talk about the king being overthrown by the poor people in the streets. So we know that for the last 5,000 years, throughout, you know, periodically, the people go into the streets, they overthrow their governments and try to demand changes. But I think that if we look at the trajectory of social protest, how it's changed is that just definitely since the 20th century, social protest has stopped being about basically overthrowing the government and trying to replace it, and it started to be either try to influence the government that's in power, or even now, today, to become some sort of form of marketing and social marketing and trying to change the discourse and spread awareness and all this kind of stuff. So I think that the reason why, if you ask specifically, why did Occupy choose the General Assembly, consensus-based assembly model, is because we were trying to manifest a form of popular sovereignty. We were trying to manifest a form of popular will, a more direct form of democracy. And I think that ultimately that's what social protests are trying to do. Social protests are trying to assert a kind of people power, but specifically getting back to this question of the social contract, really like a popular will, or like Rousseau's concept of, you know, the will of the people and all this kind of stuff. And that has been, at least the democratic myth, is that our governments are based on the consent of the governed. And that's what I think social movements have been trying to do, is demonstrate, well, you don't have our consent. And that's where things are breaking down.
Just to go back, was it a deliberate tactic to say, you know what, we're going to just stay here, right? Stay on this spot right here?
Yeah, the Occupy specifically was the merging of two social movements. It was the merging of the Tahrir Square uprising, where the people went into Egypt and they said, we will not leave until Mubarak goes, and he did go. And with the Indignados in Spain, where they instead went into the squares and they said, we're going to hold these assemblies and demonstrate a superior form of democracy. We wanted to demonstrate that there is another form of democracy. And Occupy did both. So it said, let's go to a place of symbolic importance, which is the financial districts, and let's hold these general assemblies. That's what we did. We merged those two movements, brought it to America, and then exploded to 82 countries.
You mentioned that difference and it really stemmed from the left, from a rejection of kind of the activism of the 60s and 70s. And actually, Seattle was another moment where that change was really evident. In going from, you know, we're not going to be these hierarchical organizations. We're going to be decentralized. We're going to be a lot more cooperative in how we set up these structures. And the Zapatistas kind of led that in many senses. Again, I could quote from Solnit, but I won't. At this point, can you elucidate like what that change was on the ground for you? Like how it suddenly felt very different to be in a protest movement that was about like people taking autonomous decisions together, rather than, okay, here's the ideology, this is where we're all going.
Yeah, I mean, I think the power of the globalization movement is that you have all these different groups coming together. And, you know, for example, I'm still in an institution that is very hierarchical. The labor movement, right? We still have political structures where people are elected, and a much more traditional structure. But I think we've been very informed in the conversations that we've had with these other movements that other structures are possible. And you see in the labor movement, people trying to figure out new structures for labor organizing, and what does that look like? So it's an ongoing conversation about what's the best kind of structure. And I would say there's an ongoing tension between social movements and the need for, and I would argue, you still need some institutionality so that you can continue, you know, you can have your online Facebook actions, you can have your protests, and at some point, there's some kind of organizational structure. I would argue you still need so that you can continue to fight for systemic change. And there's a tension in that. There's differences of opinions, but I still believe you need, you know, the power of an organized labor movement is the power to be able to, like in Belgium, I said, we would love to call general worker strikes where all workers are withholding their labor. That's harder to do in the United States, but that power is really important, and that comes from more of an institutional power.
And do you think that change on the ground, though, like when those things started changing, people said, look, you know, we're not going to, because to have a very hierarchical, ideologically led movement would be to lead us as activists down a path of, okay, we're going to end up, you know, becoming the Baader Meinhof gang at one end or something like that, right? And it was very much a rejection of all of that. And especially of, and maybe I'm winding too many things in here, but a rejection also of the new identity politics. And said, hang on, look, there are other people in these movements that need to be recognized and noticed, namely, first off, women. that weren't being recognized in the 60s and 70s. And so, just tease out again what it was to suddenly say, okay, look, we can all have these different identities. You could have Jose Bové, the Zapatistas, all these people from around the world, and we're going to take decisions differently. Do you think it really marked a marking point, or no?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the global justice movement has played around with different forms. I would argue today that's still in flux. I mean, the Occupy movement did express one model. And I think that the real question is knowing within our structures when to step up and step back. You've seen that in some of the climate discussions, who's speaking for whom in those discussions, how does the labor movement come and be supportive but not take over? I think all of that is how are we organizing our power sharing in these conversations is what gets shaped. I think Seattle was a moment, how do we as various organizations, big, small, some with different forms of power structures, how do we share that power to get to our ultimate goal?
Anuna, how do you take decisions in your group? In the Belgium chapter? Is that what you call yourself? What do you even call yourself?
You for Climate Belgium, I guess.
Okay.
So the thing is, I started it on my own, which means in the beginning, I was just like, okay, I'm gonna go to Brussels and we'll see, But then there were some very active and passionate other teenagers that were like, okay, we're gonna help you. And right now we have this kind of organization with 7 people in the core group and a lot of local groups, because Belgium is small, but we still have cities, So they're different
I think I've been to them all.
Yeah, exactly.
All 3 of them.
Exactly. So they're different movements in the different cities, and we have the core group called Belgium National, and the core group sees all these different communities every week to discuss what their point of view is. But at the end of the day, it's what you say in the media, So, I mean, I need to know everything that's happening, because I need to say everything in the media. I need to say where are we, what are we gonna do and stuff. So we had some argues about that, because I'm sometimes a little bit too passionate, and then
Okay. So there's personality differences for sure. How did Occupy famously, I would say, popularized the notion of consensus-based decision-making? I'm not going to ask you to give us a full lesson. We don't have time. But can you just run through maybe a few hand actions? Just explain to people what that means. And the famous call and response.
Yeah, I mean, so social movements are emerged out of the combination of a new tactic and a willing historical moment, and also a contagious mood. So Occupy had a whole series of rituals that we did that were...
Were they rituals? Rituals almost sound like... Go on, I'll let you finish, sorry.
Well, no, I think that they were rituals, because I mean, the thing about a social movement that's interesting is, when we created Occupy Wall Street, I was working at a magazine called Adbusters, and Adbusters is based in Vancouver, Canada. It's not even an American magazine, and I was living in Berkeley, California, not even on the East Coast, and the movement was taken up by people in New York City who I had never met and never heard of, and they came along with their own baggage. They had ideas like, don't make demands. So when we actually put out the call for Occupy, we actually said, let's get in the assembly and come up with a demand. And then the people in New York were like, well, we believe in prefigurative anarchism. We don't believe in demands. And so the rituals, the reason why I call them rituals is because in New York, we had a whole series of things, like there was twinkle fingers to show us, that you agreed with something. You put your fingers down to show you disagreed with something. We had the people's mic, which is that you would basically chant what someone was saying in order to broadcast it without microphones to larger audiences. But when those rituals translated to other environments,
so you would say,
you say, "Hello, everyone,"
and everyone in the room would go,
"Yeah,
yeah, you're terrible," but you get the idea.
You started by saying "mic check," and then everyone says "mic check," and then whoever said "mic check" gets to be listened to. And that was an amazing and powerful experience, because part of what social movements do is, the theme of this conference is emotion, and part of what Occupy did is that it was a tremendous sense of belonging to sit in a space and chant each other's words, right? So I think that then those things, we would see those behaviors repeated without a consciousness about why they were being done in other environments. So it became self-destructive. I mean, I think the thing about social movements is that it's very hard for them to change. So even when Occupy started to fail, we weren't able to actually change the tactics of the movement, which is something that I think all social movements subsequent to Occupy have also had trouble with.
Do you think Occupy failed? In the sense of the Rebecca Solnit sense of the word. Look, there's someone here who was inspired by what you did, and she's still going, and there's thousands of kids on the street still going.
Look, it has to do with the definition of success. The definition of success for an activist in 1917 was my movement overthrew the government and we are the ones in power, right? Now the definition of success has become I'm at a conference of powerful elites and they are using my words, right? And I'm glad that you're using my words, but that's not success. Occupy's not in power. The 99%'s not in power. I have, and similarly, I think that there's a real danger in, we have to ask, why are activists even being brought to this community of elites? Why are we being listened to? What is it that we're providing the elites? So I think that, yes, Occupy was a constructive failure. It didn't, obviously it created a new generation of activists. It did lots of positive things. But does the 99% have more power today than we did when Occupy started? No. Absolutely not. Did Occupy, even the Arab Spring, all of these movements, did Occupy manage to overthrow the power of money in our democracies? No. So there's positive things that came out of it, but to call that a success is to degrade the meaning of activism to a point where it becomes social marketing. And social marketing has its role, but we need that old kind of activism where literally it meant this movement's going to take power away from the people who have power.
I disagree with you. We're going to come to that later on. And you know why I disagree with you, because I think you know that inspiration ended up with a whole lot of change that's going on now in the sort of digital sphere. Just in case people were feeling depressed. At this point in the middle of the talk. We're going to come out to questions shortly to the audience. Can we answer maybe that question I raised at the beginning? Why should governments, democratically elected governments, let's just caveat that, be held to ransom by well-organized mobs?
I wouldn't say they're being held ransom at all. I think it's that a healthy democracy means you have a robust civil society. The canary in the coal mine, I like to say, so go unions, so go the rest of civil society. You've seen this in Brazil, you see this in the United States, you see this around the world. Just recently in Zimbabwe, fuel strikes, the labor movement goes out, they're attacked, they're imprisoned, lots of false charges. So I would not say being held ransom. I would say we are in a fight for our lives right now to make sure we have healthy, robust democracies. And with that, you need collective power, whether it's unions, whether it's climate, whether it's youth activists, people fighting, the structures of corporations. So not being held ransom, it's making sure that we have a healthy, balanced economy, which we don't have now. We would not have the levels of inequality. We would not have the levels of suffering. We wouldn't have the decisions being made around the transformation around climate that need to be happening if it was that we were living in healthy, robust democracies. And as we see the elections that just happened in Australia, that will probably happen in the EU shortly, absolutely, I would say there is a huge crisis in our democracy, and so we need more robust social movements to be pushing back.
In a sense, tied into that, is it weird for you that the language of the anti-globalization movement, as situated, generally speaking, on the left in 1999, is now being mirrored and adopted by people very much who position themselves very much on the right? When you have Steve Bannon or Nigel Farage talking about the global elites and the globalists, that is exactly what was being said on the left. How did that happen? How did those same issues percolate from one end of the political spectrum right to the other? And is it strange for you that happened?
So first, I just want to challenge you that it wasn't an anti-globalization movement. I really, that phrase, because I think that people on the left really see it was about the kind of globalization, that whole concept I said. It wasn't just the weather, the globalization. It's the kind of globalization that people wanted to see. They weren't against things being global. And that's the difference where I think the Bannons and others who are challenging all kinds of globalization. I think that on the left, what we are asking for is a new vision. We're asking for how are we rethinking our multilateral system so that they're fit for purpose, so that they reflect the social needs, the robust social contract that we need to develop. So I think it's a different. They have used a lot of the same language, but I would argue it's a very different endpoint that we're trying to get to.
Okay, but there's a kind of subtle difference here, which was that I feel that in 1999 and circa around that period of time, people came to the table saying, okay, look, I'm from Italy. I'm very passionate about my Italian culture, or France, or wherever it is. Or Hawaii or New Zealand, right? This is who I stand for. We can be part of a brotherhood of people, but I want to be able to protect my culture, my traditions against these outside forces, which would have me all shopping in, in eating McDonald's and drinking coffee in Starbucks, etc., etc. That was very much part of the heart of all of that. We spoke about this, Micah, on the phone just before, and in a sense, Occupy seemed to be actually quite happy with, being a hipster from Buenos Aires or Brooklyn or Berlin. It was all the same thing. Was that a problem?
Well, I mean, I think that there is basically a global culture of dissent. And so with Occupy, what happened is if you look at the sociological data of who took part. So Occupy spread, first of all, let's remember, to 82 countries in 1,000 cities. So it was everywhere for that brief period of time. And if you look at who took part in the social movements, they shared a few common features, which is that they were what is called the cognitariat. They were overeducated, highly indebted, digitally enabled young people. And that was true whether or not you looked at the protests in Russia or the protests in America. So part of it is that I think we are part of there's these global cultures of dissent. But getting back to this point of anti-globalization, I think that when the anti-globalization movement started in 1999, it definitely was anti-globalization. And I think it became something like alter-globalization, which is what you're kind of referring to. And I think that part of what happened is that we had to absorb the global structure because we were fighting global forces. And so what's happening now is that activism we are globalists. At least I'm a globalist, because we build global social movements in order to solve global social problems. That's, I think, one of the kind of distinguishing things, is that we ended up accepting that, yes, you need global institutions. We just want global, kind of activist-y institutions, I would say, or that activism itself becomes a global institution, perhaps.
Okay, let's go out to questions. Good, we have a few already. How are we going to do this? You've got mics. Okay, let's start with that gentleman and then go to this person over here in the front.
Thank you. This is a fascinating panel. Just one question. I think towards the end, you kind of brought it back together about the right and the left. So my question is about this. So the protest you're talking about, you're displaying here, has a angelic quality to it. It's very forceful, does things, but also seems very cathartic. But when the right takes over, they become populist. It's like flirtation with fascism and all that. And it's just like a thunder, and it's very, very effective. And you were talking about effectiveness versus, protest. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that.
Is right protest on the right more effective? I can name,
The Tea Party.
Yeah, but is the actual protest any more effective? It might be that the politics get adopted, but is the actual protest any more effective? I can name the Countryside Alliance was one that sort of failed in Britain. And UKIP still don't have any MPs. I mean, just from the British perspective, they still don't have a single one. It's amazing. Go on, sorry, Kathy.
I would just use the example from the United States. It gets back to my point around having to have a strategy. The Tea Party was incredibly strategic in the United States. And so what did the left do? They said, hey, that was really strategic. We're using protests in a broader way, but they would go to town hall meetings, whether it was on health care or abortion, and they were there and they were present, not just protesting, but saying, we're holding you accountable, we elected you, we're going to kick you out of office. So it was a protest with a very direct target around a political end. And then then we have on the left Indivisible, which has sort of taken some of that, like you show up and you hold them accountable and you try to get those politicians to respond. So I would say protest with a strategy. I think that the right has been, you haven't seen the same mass protests in the United States. We have some March for Lives, but they're not the same like you saw with the Women's March and other ones.
Do you want to answer? Anuna, do you want to answer? You don't have to. There's lots of other questions.
No, I can give it a try. So I think I actually don't know if right strikes are more effective or anything. I just think, but again, like I'm 17-year-old, I don't have the experience and stuff, but I really think that a lot of strikes from the right are most of the time based on fear. And a lot of people are very afraid in society and like very scared of losing things and stuff. So if you play on that, I think it is very effective.
Just before you answer, is there anyone who would situate themselves on the right and feels that like they've been on a protest that has really worked or hasn't failed, or would like to answer that question themselves? No. Okay. Go ahead.
Can I just say one thing
Yeah.
quickly? I
Yeah,
think
quickly.
I think it gets back to this question of revolution versus reform. So I think that if you look at the history of social protests on the left, we were extremely successful. We had the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the American Revolution, French Revolution. We decolonized Africa, etc. But those came with tremendous amount of pain. We had the gulags and stuff. Like basically there was a kind of a disavowal of revolution among the left after we saw what the consequences of revolution were. So I think the left has tended towards reform. And on the right, I think it's a different experience. I think the reason why you're saying that they're more effective, quote unquote, is because they've gone for power, and through electoral means and otherwise. They've literally gone for power. Whereas if you look at what the left was doing after the failure of Occupy Wall Street, it was we just doubled down on street protests. We had Black Lives Matter. We just had endless street protests. Very, very, very little attempts at actually gaining power. I think the left is afraid of power in a certain sense. And I'm talking about the radical left, not the elite left, which I think the elite left really wants to hold on to its power and is scared of losing its power. But I'm talking about the capacity of social movements. I mean, point to a leftist...
Why are they afraid of gaining power?
Because look what happens. Like, even if you point at the glorious, like, the French Revolution, the French revolutionaries put people onto barges, had mass, kangaroo courts, and then drowned them in mass. Like, all of the leftist revolutions, if you look at what happened, was horrible. And I think that this gets back.
Can we say that was a long time ago at this point?
No, I think that's deep in our DNA, which is that I think that we're still afraid to open that can of worms. I think that we're not like this. In the opening panel, someone asked, what's the pain we're willing to take? And I think the left is not willing to say, look, I'm going to have a revolution knowing that horrible things are going to happen because it's somehow necessary. That's the thing is, I think that the Russian revolutionaries, the Chinese revolutionaries, they understood that horrible things happen in revolutions, but it was necessary. And I think the left is very scared of saying, I'm going to take power and institute my popular will, because look at the consequences.
Person over here, yes.
Well,
Do you want to say where you're from?
Oh, yeah, sure.
You don't have to.
I'm Joanna Bryson. I'm from the University of Bath and in the UK. I want to talk about something that so far only one person's mentioned at all, which is one of the two words, which is structure. So in the UK, we had the government tried to take away the retirement funding from academics, and we had I think it was the longest strike in the history of the UK. Now imagine this.
So when was this?
This is last year. Okay. Students were, they had their classes taken away from them for weeks, right? But everyone could see that this was blatantly false. We were able to show mathematically that there was no reason to say that we couldn't, our retirement fund wasn't solvent and everything. It was completely an effort of the government to rake in money to solve the British government problems. So the point was, this was a massive protest that had a huge amount of disruption, and all we achieved was the reversing of a policy back to where we were. And yes, you think about the Russian Revolution, and Stalin killed more people than Hitler, right? You think about the Arab Spring, oh, isn't it wonderful? No, Mubarak is gone, but they killed more protesters than they'd ever killed before, just like a year later. And nobody talks about that. We all talk about, isn't it wonderful? Twitter took this stuff down. It seems to me that an awful lot of the protests, you say, oh, politicians do your jobs, but their jobs are harder, right? When they can't figure out what's happening next. So a lot of the protest is about stripping away the structure by which someone could have achieved something. And there's not enough mechanisms to go from this. And yes, there's things, I've also protested in the streets about, Trump and about Brexit and, various things. But there's not enough going into building back up the alternative structures. If we can show that one solution is better than the other, then that's great. But if no one is creating the new solutions, then we're only destroying things. And then, yes, indeed, the right becomes into power because they tend to be single leaders or whatever, simple, no structure.
So you've got some responses here. Let's not necessarily all get into a left versus right thing, and that's probably, in fact, that is my fault. I'll take responsibility for starting that, framing it that way. But just in terms of when you say structures, so very briefly, what do you mean by structures? Because that's quite an indefinite word.
I mean institutions with which we do things like make sure that there's redistribution. One of the things that causes war is massive levels of inequality, so individuals can do random things, right?
All right.
So
Okay.
that takes a lot of governance, and that's a lot of structure.
Thank you. Anuna, do you want to respond first, and then Kathy?
Yeah, so about the alternative thing, the point is that, for example, in Belgium, we see that politicians are clearly lost. Do I have to stop talking?
No, keep going.
Okay.
I'm just
So we see
signaling
that
to the audience,
politicians-
sorry.
sorry. So we see that politicians are clearly lost concerning the climate change issue. And so we made up an expert panel of 150 experts sitting down together, but it were like environmentalists, but they were also writers, experts, economics. And they sat down together and they made up a climate action plan to directly implement into the Belgian policy. So it's really like we have the targets from the Paris Agreement and the tools to get there. So we are shouting on the streets, saying that they should do their job. And what is that? They should have brought the expert panel together. I shouldn't have done that. I literally did that. I'm 17 years old. I shouldn't have brought 150 experts together. That was the only demand we had. You have to listen to the experts again. So I think, for example, for our strikes, we do offer an alternative, but I think many other strikes also do offer alternatives. I don't think that there are so many strikes where we just like point out the problem instead of saying how we could do it differently.
You can applaud. You're allowed to applaud if you want to applaud.
I agree, and I think, you know, structures and social movements constantly need to be saying, are our structures what we need to be fit for purpose? Or I want to give one example because people have brought up the Arab Spring a couple times to say, you know, sort of Egypt versus Tunisia. Can I look? I guess I'm supposed to keep looking this way. Sorry to have my back to everybody. And I just really quickly, so the biggest democratic structure in Tunisia is the labor movement, the UGTT. And they originally, you know, in order to survive, supported Ben Ali, the dictator, right? That's how you had big public sector, and there were lots of jobs then. And there was a critical point during the Arab Spring where the UGTT had to say, which side are you on? I mean, that's the famous labor question, right? And they decided that because their membership, workers were setting themselves on fire and workers were protesting from the grassroots, they had to listen to their base and their membership. And that is what swung it. And they challenged Ben Ali, and the rest is history. They won the Nobel Peace Prize with the business and human rights community. I bring this up because today, Tunisia, because of the reforms that the labor movement with allies has done to the constitution, they continue to be, you know, that sort of important movement in civil society in Tunisia that has kept some of these reforms going. And if you look at the other countries, you didn't have that structure in Egypt. You have a government-dominated union structure. Almost the entire Middle East and North Africa had mostly government-dominated union structures that were unable to make that shift. And so that's why you've seen a lot of the struggles. And as I go back to my point, so go labor movements, so go a lot of civil society and social movements. So that comparison, I think, is important around structures. And the UGTT had to change. It couldn't say we're the same UGTT during Ben Ali as we are today. They're constantly women in power, questioning different religions, part of their structure. So they're proud of that, and they talk about that.
One more question. We're going to have more audience questions afterwards, so don't worry, there will be more time. There's a gentleman over here. Go ahead.
I hope you can hear me. I have a bit of laryngitis, but I was thinking about what the gentleman narrator said about how there has been this shift in vocabulary from left to right, and in the beginning regarding trade and international commerce. But I also think about the United States, how there's been a shift in the vocabulary from left and right, for example, regarding identity politics and other sort of areas of American life. And my question is basically, do you believe that perhaps the left in the United States and globally, I suppose, has been a victim of its own success? That vocabulary was successful, that it did, in its way, institute change. And is there and my other question would be, is there
No, wait,
any
just
way-
stick to that first question. What do you mean by victim of its success? I don't understand it.
when,
but,
for example, I think that, for example, the vocabulary was useful. It was something that resonated with people, so it was co-opted by the right.
right, okay.
And it's the same when you look at contemporary identity politics in the United States, the same thing is happening. So I'm wondering if the left was a victim of its own success.
Passionate answer from Kathy coming.
No, I mean, I don't think we were successful. If we were successful, we would not have the levels of inequality that we have now. We have, people keep asking me whenever I travel, well, so Trump's creating jobs. You guys have record job numbers. I keep getting that. I'm like, we have record inequality. What kind of jobs are being created? If you look at where the growth is happening, it's happening at the top. It's not happening. You've got some ordinances that are pushing up the bottom. But so my point is, I don't think that maybe in narratives, but in actual systemic change, I would argue that we have not been as successful as we would like.
No, but stealing the words is important, right? If it turns out that the words can be stolen, remodified, and brought out onto the street or wherever, or into rallies, and you can hear Trump saying, we've got to rail against these global elites, right? Or, we've got to make sure that people have jobs, or we've got to make sure that trade conditions are fair, right? You don't hear the left in America talking about that, do you?
So, I would just say
You
that,
did,
yeah,
but not
I
anymore.
would say that you could see overlaps of narratives, especially during the election, where the labor movement would say similar things on trade policy that Trump would co-opt. But then you must look at the details. What are his policies after his narrative? It's been a tax policy that's been horrible for working people in the United States.
Sure, but that's
It's
the
been-
details. We're talking about the words, the language, the
words,
stories. Those
absolutely,
count first,
absolutely,
right?
Yes, but in terms of being successful, I would say.
Okay.
I'm saying actually having a social movement that has done the change it wanted to. No, we haven't been successful. Has the narrative been taken so that workers have listened to Trump? Absolutely. But we haven't, I would say that's not because we've been overly successful in shifting the paradigm of corporate power. I guess I would clarify.
Okay, we're going to have to rapidly move to part 2. Very quick
Yeah,
answer and
very
very quick answer.
So just one thing, I'm sorry to say this, but I think that left and right is so old-fashioned. And by coming on the streets every week, thank you.
You can applaud if you want. I already took responsibility for doing that.
By coming on the streets every week, we demand a system change. And let me just say, left and right is not in the new system. Because there are so many global issues and in the day of today that we have to stop putting them in one of those boxes.
I heard this 10 years ago, by the way. I'm sort of a veteran of this conference. Thanks. But it may, you might want to take that high five back when I say this. That 8, 9 years ago, people were like, look, left and right, it's so old. People on the right don't think so, right? They hang out together deliberately because they think they're brethren, right? It's weird. But they do it because they love each other.
Yeah, I do realize that, but it is old-fashioned, and we need to get it out of the system because it's really unhealthy if politicians keep saying us, "Oh, you're just from the left parties." When we are tackling literally the problem of an existential crisis facing us, it's not a left problem. Seriously.
I feel that for impartiality reasons, so now high five everyone. Okay, I'm going to move to part 2. Where I want to start looking at solutions. We've got about 15 minutes, and then we've got another 15 minutes for questions or so. Kathy, tell me about the rest of the world. What's going on that's new? I mean, from a protest space, it's not just like everything.
Well, I think, again, what's new is we have the rise. I want to look. I just got back from Latin America. I just got back from Bogota. You see Brazil. What was the first thing that Bolsonaro did? He came after the labor movement. He's tried to bankrupt the labor movement. This has had an enormous impact because, as people know, the labor movement there is a social movement made up of the landless people, youth. So goes this labor coalition. That was the first line of attack. Macri's first line was to take the labor ministry in Argentina and get rid of it and put it under the commerce. So you see where a lot of it in Bogota, and I know Colombia is, here coming to the OECD, but some of the commitments it's made on improving labor standards and the violence against human rights defenders, it's increasing. Its latest development plan goes backwards in its commitments. So I think what you see is where, unfortunately, we're in a moment where a certain set of policies are being emboldened. People that make commitments, politicians that make commitments aren't being held accountable in the way that we'd like them to be. So I think despite all of that, I would say, not to end on a depressing note, people continue to organize and rise up. The Brazilians there is a protest every single day for the democracy movement in Brazil. They are like the climate, every single day, every single week, people are rising up. People continue in very hard circumstances in the Middle East and North Africa. You see our Algerian independent labor movements in this current moment continuing to rise up. I just want to say, you mentioned the umbrella revolution. Incredibly important moment right now as China looks to an extradition law that could have a real impact on freedom of speech, assembly, and association. What it basically says is if your toe is in Hong Kong, whether you're an activist, those that did the umbrella revolution, or you're a business person, you could be brought up on a charge and you're immediately extradited back to mainland China to be tried under that system. These are amazing moments, but despite that, the closing of space around civil society, activists continue to take great risks to keep those spaces open.
Here's a thought. Micah, I'm going to turn this to you. All protests are failures, because as soon as they succeed, they're called movements, uprisings or revolutions. Agree with that statement?
No, I mean, I don't want to go so far to say that all protests are failures, because I think that there is, like I said, I think that a revolution would be a success, at least temporarily.
Well, if they're successful, they get rebranded, is what I'm trying to say, right?
Yes.
That's just a protest, right?
Right.
Oh, it was an uprising, right?
Right.
Kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, maybe. I mean, I think maybe that if they stay within the level of protest, they fail. But I wanna respond to this question of like kind of what's new, because I think that what is new is that I think that governments and elites are starting to understand that their power cannot function without some sort of interaction with social movements, even more so that they might actually need social movements in order to achieve the things that they want to achieve. And I think that that's what new is, that the nature of power is changing. You can no longer be a superpower who just has material superiority and therefore gets to dictate onto the world. You now need to be able to demonstrate a kind of engagement among your citizen population in order to kind of achieve these things. So it's both demonstrating an engagement among your population, but also realizing that these, like climate change, income inequality, these things will only be solved through some sort of collaboration with global social movements. So I think that what's changing is this conception of protest and activism as an adversarial force, and instead we're going to see governments who start to realize that their power is derived from their capacity to work with social movements or even create their own social movements, which frankly gets back to kind of, I think, how it was with, earlier revolutionary movements.
You write that we need to move to a more nuanced theory of protest. Actually, protest failure, I should say. What's so unnuanced about our current theories of protest failure and why they fail?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say that most activists ascribe their failure to either police repression or a failure of kind of tactics and strategy, which I think that actually what's happening is that there's something deeper. On the one hand, I think that protests are failing because the activist culture that we have is broken, so that we are not the activists that we need. I'm including myself in that, and that's I think that's kind of a sad realization that there's something about activist culture itself that is unable to withstand the tremendous pressure to conform to movement orthodoxy, and that's why you see activists repeating the same failed tactics and behaviors, such as organizing one-day large-scale marches and stuff like that. So I think that what's broken is a kind of activist culture, but I think that also getting back to my earlier point, there is something about movement's relationship to power that is shifting, and I think that both elites haven't caught up to that fact, and I think that movements also haven't caught up to that fact.
Anuna, do you expect to fail?
No, because we already succeed. And that is because we have now a climate action plan. We have thousands of people on the street every week. For me, we have a revolution. And I really feel like we are discussing things about climate change right now way more than we did. So making it a top priority, I mean, that is maybe the most important thing that we did. Politicians are talking about it again. So we succeeded. The politicians, no, they failed. And I don't know if they're going to succeed. But we are, and we are still succeeding. You know, and I think that's just a thing that we need to remember, that all of these people coming on the street, it did have a tremendous effect, and that's what everybody is saying. So we shouldn't, like, it's not, we're not coming on the streets to take over the power. We don't want to be the new politicians and the new world leaders. Obviously, we are going to be them because we're young people, so, you know. But the point is that right now, we just want to remind the politicians that it is their job and their responsibility. It is not ours. So I don't have to be Secretary General of the UN right now. I just want him to know that he has to make climate change the top priority.
Kathy, there's or I'm putting it to you, but it could be to anyone. There's this point about how older movements used to enculturate, is the word, people properly. So they tell them not just a story, or they not just give them a tactic. Like, we're coming out for this march today. They're like, here are the stories about our movement, right? Here's this book you can read to give you more intellectual grounding in what our ideas are. Here's the art you can watch. Here's the film that we've made. And it's like a world that you can enculturate people into, right? Those are presumably, therefore, much more longer-lasting things, because they stick with you. It's better storytelling, rather than, oh yeah, I went on a march one day and we tried to stand for this, and then it didn't work. How do we is that something we want to get back to? Is that something we desperately need? Is that something that the unions are addressing?
I mean, the labor movement has a long history, so we have many stories to tell. But I also think, you know, we're in a new moment telling new stories about the way people are rising up and the way collective action is happening. And, you know, I'll point in the United States, there are, you know, the famous people, the game makers of Fortnite are organizing. And that's a new story that my children are very excited to know that the Fortnite gamers are organizing.
Wait, hang on. Fortnite, if the audience doesn't know, is an incredibly violent assassination game played with multiple players across the world. What are they organizing to do?
The makers, the gamers are organizing. They want a union. They want, you know, collective action. They want to improve their workplaces. You know, I think one thing that, so I think storytelling is still really important. I think the stories are changing. I would say that we don't throw out the stories that we've had, because they teach us a lot about where we need to go. I know, for example, the story in the United States of our worst industrial disaster, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, where, you know, garment workers were trapped, was a story that was used in when Bangladesh had its worst industrial disaster. And we said, what did we learn then that has to be done now? How are Bangladeshi unions and their allies having to organize? So I think it's, you know, incredibly important to continue learning from each other, telling those stories. We hear learning from history, people that are writing about it, because it needs to inform where we're going. And also recognize there's new forms being created out there. We need to continue to document them and share them.
Well, I mean, I would say that there is something, I think your question does touch on something, which is that I think that the radicals of the past were much more sophisticated in their understanding both of social change and the history of attempts at social change. So, I mean, just if you read like Trotsky or Lenin or any of those older thinkers, the first thing that happens when you read that is like, you're just lost. You're like, wow, I can't even understand this, the nuance between the different parties and ideologies that are arguing with each other. I think that's true. I think that today's level of discourse about social change and activism is very much lower than it was 100 years ago, and I think that comes out in a lot of ways. I think that they were much.
Is it lower than it was 20 years ago?
I think that the breakdown happened. I mean, if I were going to put my finger on when the breakdown happened, I think that it started to happen, like I was saying earlier, around the 60s or 70s, with a kind of disavowal of that history. I think that, you know, there was this kind of movement against. No one wants to say that they're a Leninist or a Stalin. I mean, some people, you know, no average person wants to say that. Whereas I think that there was a.
Can we say no one should want to say that?
Well, I don't know if we should or shouldn't. I mean, I think that the issue is that most of us agree that we should not, and I think that with that has been a tremendous loss of a kind of complexity of thought. I think that today's people, activists, myself included, I'm not saying I'm anywhere better, but I'm saying that today's activists would have a lot of difficulty parsing the sophisticated intellectual and historical and political arguments that would have been commonplace to a worker who was part of the Communist Party 100 years ago.
Yeah, but then people don't know that much about the Bible anymore, and that turns out to be really important to culture. And yet we still have cultural conversations that are incredibly complex. I mean, I could probably talk to almost anyone in this room for about 4 hours of Game of Thrones. I mean, maybe that isn't Game of Thrones isn't clearly the Bible, but people have complex conversations. It's just they're not about certain things, and they are about certain other things. You could also have we're about to have a incredibly complex conversation about new digital methods in about 1.5 minutes when I shut up. There are new conversations going on though. Does that? I mean, why harken back to the past?
I think what I'm trying to say, like, if you look at like Lenin, and they studied, for example, to give a specific example, they actually studied like the Paris Commune and developed theories for why the Paris Commune failed, and then used those theories to change their behaviors when their turn came. I think that today's activists have lost a lot of that sophisticated nuance, such that we don't have a theory for why the Russian Revolution changed, or what we would do if we were the Russian revolutionaries, because we don't want to be the Russian revolutionaries, and also because we don't have that capacity anymore. So I think that means that if you were to transport back in time and have a conversation with the average activist in the past, I think we would be out of our depth, myself included. I think we would just be like, whoa, I can't even understand the difference between Menshevik and Bolshevik, and why does this matter? And like, we would just be out of our depth. I think that's the danger of activism today.
Let's talk digital then. Kathy, I want to ask you first about the app you're developing, or the apps, or the digital methods the unions are developing, specifically in regards to the Marriott Hotel.
Sure. So there's a couple things happening. One is, I'll start with the apps. We recognize that there were a lot of apps out there that existed to collect data, and it was not being controlled by workers themselves. It was being controlled by for-profit organizations. And so the AFL-CIO developed a new model called Action Builder, which is an app that workers themselves came around the table, said, what would we need when we're trying to organize unions, talk to our coworkers? And so a model of building technology that is not for profit, that's about actually building power for workers, and is being shaped and developed by workers. So that's one model. The second is, how do we deal, and this is the conversation about work in the future, you asked about Marriott, a new collective bargaining agreement that Marriott just entered into with its union in the United States. It says anytime a new technology is being introduced into the workplace, it should not be assumed it's being seen as better. So, greater surveillance, either it's going to be used for greater surveillance of the workers or help the workers reduce their hours. And so they now have a clause that says any new technology needs to be negotiated with the workers and tested by the workers themselves, so that it's integrated in a way that makes sense for working people.
So Occupy inspired, and I know this from personal testimonies from lots of people, a whole digital movement, which most people in this room might know cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, but there's a thing called Ethereum, and there's thousands of developers working on this. They all were inspired, and it came out of, the history of Bitcoin is itself that something came out of the financial collapse in 2009. They're creating what could be, let's just call them digital cooperatives, because we could spend a long time talking about the technicalities of it all. Does that stuff excite you? Does it excite you, one, that you inspired some of that, and two, that what they're doing is really inspiring, because it's taking all of this kind of decision-based, consensus-based decision-making processes and making them digital, and so scalable. Does that excite you?
Yes, one of my secret passions is I'm way into cryptocurrency. I mean, Bitcoin was the inventor of Bitcoin, anonymous inventor of Bitcoin, embedded a reference to the financial collapse in the original source code. And so I've been following Bitcoin since basically Occupy Wall Street, because I remember they were a similar kind of concept.
They're born at the same moment. Yeah.
Yes, they came out of the same kind of. They were a different form of protest. And so I think that absolutely. I think that one of the things that is developing, which will have a tremendous impact on the future, is the development of smart contracts, moving a kind of distributed governance to a kind of decentralized way. But I also think that there's a tremendous need for skepticism. I think it's very dangerous. If you look at like the distribution of wealth within cryptocurrency economies, it's even worse than our current economy.
That's true.
The distribution of wealth among Ethereum and Bitcoin is even worse. And so it's like one step forward, two steps back in this weird way. But I would rather take that step forward, because I do think that smart contracts, cryptocurrencies offer some sort of way out.
Yeah. And then the general idea is that, for example, you could run insurance systems, you could run governance systems, you could run any organization in a way that, there wasn't necessarily any equity, right? Or if you wanted to run big platforms like Uber, say, like you didn't have to have an Uber in the middle, right? You could just have these things, and you can have these things decentralized. And then people are building them, and they've got billions behind them. So it's not like they're just sitting there tinkering away in their garage. They're actually well funded.
Yes, they are a demonstration of a kind of leaderless model. But I mean, oftentimes the idealism of cryptocurrency outpaces the reality of cryptocurrency.
Sure.
But the idealism of cryptocurrency is great, and I've been an early adopter myself. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Briefly, how does the digital interact with what you do?
Yeah, a lot of scientists say that technology and digital things will be the solutions, right? So, I mean, obviously, it's a very, very important thing. And for the movement itself, we use a lot of digital things, like all of our mobilizations is social media, and we use it all the time. We make all these videos. I mean, everything happens online, except for when we go on the streets, obviously. So I think it's...
Right, that seems weird that the very last thing that you do is very undigital, and it's all you're using digital tools to create these very undigital things, which are people, like a very old thing to do, like use your feet and stand in a public space.
Yeah, exactly, but that's the thing I mean. What I should be doing is sitting in school, but I'm on the streets. I'm breaking the rules. That's how we got attention. And that's true, though, we had so many protests on Sundays and in the weekends, and people just posting things and sending letters to governments. We did everything, but you don't get attention if you don't break the rules. And it is a bit hard to break the rules online. I mean, we can all download Popcorn Time, but I mean, we won't get there with that,
Interesting, because we live obviously in a much more heightened attention economy because of digital tools. So in a sense, you might have to be doing what you're doing to compete in an attention economy. Let's not get segued into that. Let's go out to the audience for questions. Sorry, Kathy. Okay, hands up if you have questions. Okay, let's go for that gentleman in the back there. And then next up, this gentleman over here. And then there may be that gentleman. I'm looking for diversity at this point as well.
I am Gerhard Vorwald, and I'm the managing director of an NGO. It's called Close the Gap Worldwide. So what we want is to close the gap between the very rich and the rest of the world. And we made two proposals. They are already here in the OECD. And one is to finance the UN Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. And for this, we want a tribute. We call it a tribute for the foreign exchange. So there's a big speculation market. They do every day $5 trillion of turnover. Okay. And if we just put 1/10,000th of this as a fee, we will get 100 billion a year to finance this.
Right, so you're looking for a transaction tax. What's your
no,
question
it's not
to the...
a transaction tax.
It's a sort of a transaction tax. What's your question to the panel?
It is now, I mean, this young woman here, she is working, she wants just ideas to give to the governments.
Okay.
And I want her, if she would be able to go with this, so that we can go to this aim.
Thank you. The gentleman over here, and we'll take maybe one other question and try and answer them.
Very short question for Micah and Kathy. Based on your experience, if you could give one bit of advice to a 17-year-old climate activist, what would that be in one phrase?
Not to Anuna, obviously. She doesn't need any advice. Okay, and one other question. Do we say the gentleman over here, at the front here, with the fetching tie? Do you want to give the mic to... Okay, she's coming. Okay, all right, thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm Juuso Januniemi, a European federalist from Finland. So I deal with systemic change, and my question kind of concerns that. So in public policy, you often talk about how once a group is well organized and has a vested interest in a certain policy, they are quite likely to get it through because the general public doesn't care. But we all are dealing with systemic change here as well. So do you think that this theory applies in our situation? And if yes, in what ways?
You want to answer that?
I want to answer this question here real quick. I
Go.
would just say that for young activists, I think the most important thing is to never protest the same way twice. I think that the continuation of the same protest tactic oftentimes is why movements fail.
Which
I
is
did
weird
it,
because
I did it already 19 times, so
right.
she told me a while ago.
But isn't persistence the thing?
No, I think that the way that the status quo works is that it becomes more and more resistant to the repetition of the tactic. There's something about the social organism that inculcates itself. I would say that they are already training to deal with that tactic times 10. Like they see the tactic and they train to defeat it.
I do remember from the student protests in 2010, which had a singular aim, stop the government from tripling student fees, failed. But one thing that there was learned was that, but this is the problem, to defeat the police from closing the protests down, people stayed fluid and changed up tactics. But then you're having a running, discussion with the police, if you want, or a battle with the police, and that's not really the point. You're supposed to be trying to get the government to change things, and there you are trying to avoid the police from clamping you down. Kathy, do you want to answer advice from your younger self, or from your older self to your younger self, if you could give it now?
Well, I would love to first, hopefully she will give us advice as well.
Yes.
Because I think we have a lot to learn from a younger generation that's taking enormous risks, whether around gun violence or climate. It's been amazing. So I want to hear your advice back to us older folks. I would just say that it's a long haul, and some of the best advice I got in my activism was remember to be creative and have fun. I think activists, we take ourselves very seriously, and that leads to some of the burnout. And I can already see that there's a lot of creative energy going into it, and to remember it's going to be a long journey to get to systemic change. And so to also remember to have fun along the way with the people you're meeting, and enjoy, because it's going to be a long haul to get to the systemic change.
Anuna, I'm sorry, people must always try and give you advice all the time. So what advice do you give, people, either here or actually to your peers? I want to know, what do you tell other 16, 17-year-olds?
To my peers.
Yeah.
I have more advice to give to the politicians, but I can also...
No, we know that, though, so that's fine. Go.
So yeah, the thing is, to my peers, I think the most important thing to remember is that it is possible. Because the only thing we hear is that it's not possible. But then again, I mean, look at what humanity has done. We made a whole world run on technology in only 1 century. We ended 2 world wars. We put a man on the moon, And John F. Kennedy said back then, we don't do this because it's easy, we do this because it's hard. And I think that's the most important thing for young people to remember, that they don't get a burnout and they're not like, oh my God, this is not gonna happen, we're going to fail. Because this battle is really important. It is about our future. We are facing the 6th mass extinction. So we really need to believe in it, all of us. And I really think they do, because thousands of people are coming on the streets because they still believe in their future and they are ready to fight for it. And they have not given up, because with a giving up attitude, we're not gonna get there. And that's poorly enough the attitude I find with very much politicians and adults, because they've been fighting for so long and it's not happening.
We've got 5 minutes left. Let's take a couple more questions. Yes, this gentleman over here and this lady over here in the yellow jacket.
Thank you. Anthony Smith-Meyer, wannabe governance activist. I realize I'm not. There's something which you said, in fact, Kathy, which is really important, and that is that the lessons to be learned are coming from the younger generation. I heard a wonderful comparison of age, demography, with acceptability of change. That those who are under 30, they are living in the now. They are living the life that exists on Earth today. And those between 30 and 50 are struggling but think it's cool to try and adapt. Whereas those who are over 50, they're basically rejecting the existing situation and trying to fight to stay in charge. Now, the problem is...
Can I ask how old you are?
Me?
Yes, just so we can bracket you in those one of those 3 things.
How old am I?
Yes.
I got grey hair, I'm 62.
Okay.
And I'm trying desperately to stay in Anuna's mindset, which is why I teach undergraduates, which is a privilege. Now, the problem is that you have social structures which have been built up over a long period of time, which are engineered to keep the status quo. And it's really difficult, and we see that through the democratic systems that we have the Nordic systems, we have the Belgium system. I'm Norwegian, by the way, and I live in Luxembourg. We have acceptability in certain of these democracies to take on these discussions and try and be constructive. But in many others, it's very, very difficult. And I just wonder, you say that revolution is out of fashion. Don't we need some form of revolution to break the existing paradigm of democracy because it's not working? We need to find a new solution. And I just don't see how we can break through the inertia of my generation to find new solutions that will work.
Let's just answer that because it's a big question, and then I'm going to try and get one extra question in. Go. Big question, but short answer.
Yeah, I agree that a revolution is necessary, and I think to use your paradigm, the challenge is to get the under 30-year-olds to want to have power. I think that the issue is that the under 30-year-olds, maybe even under 50-year-olds, it's like out of fashion to want power because we think it's somehow dirty or bad. I don't know the reason. So I think that absolutely if we could get under 30-year-olds to suddenly be like, we need a revolution and our generation is the one to do it, then I think we would see some beautiful things. But I think until then, we're just going to be kind of spinning in this circle.
I think, by the way, millennials are very conservative. Millennials being almost 40 basically now to 26, forget the lower bounds. But I think they're very conservative people.
Generation Z rule.
Yeah, on both of these points, quickly, I think we are presented with a generation that has lost faith in democracy, and that's being reflected in people willing to vote a different way, so that's a huge thing we're up against. Absolutely, we cannot afford to keep tweaking, and I say, what people have done over the past decades is tweak neoliberalism, a human rights movement that makes it a little bit better, indexes that make us feel like we're living our life better, but I mean, we can't tweak it. Right? That's not going to get us to where we're trying to get on a new system to deal with the transformation that the climate movement and others and the workers' movement is trying to get at.
Lady over here, last question. We've got 1 minute left. I'm being signaled at, going furiously. No, 1 minute. I'm going to haggle for more time. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. My name is Stephanie Villadiego, and I'm an independent consultant. And my question was, we've seen in the discussion great examples of protests and how effective they can be, but they have all taken places in environments where there are certain kinds of security guarantees, right? Like Belgium, the US. What happens in other cases, and I was wondering thoughts or advice on other settings, such as some that have been mentioned, where these security guarantees are not necessarily in place, and as Kathy mentioned, in Colombia or in Brazil, or even in the Middle East, where protesting, like the worst case is not that your protests fail, but that you get killed or that you put your security or those that are close to you at risk. So any thoughts on that?
I mean, we can harken back to Syria and just remind ourselves that Syria started off with a series of popular protest marches for democracy. It did not start as a civil war.
I mean, people, absolutely. We're sitting here talking about activism from a very comfortable, privileged space, so we should absolutely acknowledge that. I used the case of Zimbabwe where I wasn't sure if my colleagues were going to be killed for protesting fuel. So people, activists every day are stepping up. I would say one thing that I appreciate about being part of the global labor movement is we remind those authoritarian governments, we're watching you. We were on the Zimbabwean government daily telling them, we know those activists are in jail, we're following you. We do it in Brazil. And so we do that. That's one thing about having a structure. That in no time when somebody's in prison, we're able to mobilize ourselves and keep the pressure on those countries. If not, what those countries want is that those activists disappear into silence, and that's a commitment that our movement has, making sure that doesn't happen.
Anuna, for final word with you. There are people, presumably around the world, who also try and do what you do, but can't.
Yeah, exactly, so that's the point. Like, I see these things happening every day because people are like texting us for like, how do you do it? So actually, I hope to get an answer from this because it is like it's the worst thing ever. Like, police is helping us in the streets with our demonstrations. They're blocking the streets so that we can just walk through. We did one illegal thing for 2 days, like sitting in front of the parliament where you can't demonstrate. The worst things they did is just they didn't give us our tents, so we need to sleep in the ground. But that's it. So I think this comes back to the global issue. And the fact that we need to tackle this globally because there are some countries who can't do this, and indeed we are very privileged of the fact that we can even do this activism. So we as well need to stand up for these countries who can't.
Well, look, time is up, unfortunately. It always goes that way. Thank you very much for being here, for attending, for asking questions, for listening to our panel. It's been a real privilege to chair it. Can we give a round of applause to the three panelists? That was great.